Our next speaker is RJ Sudlow, and he's a principal IT security engineer, a cybersecurity practitioner with more than 8 years of hands-on experience in penetration testing of network infrastructure, web applications, and social engineering assessments. Recently, he was moved from the red to the blue team to help organizations understand cyber risk, navigate regulatory requirements, and proactively identify threats within their infrastructure. So I welcome to the stage RJ Sudlow with CIMA Statement of Guidance and You, How to Navigate the New Regulations.
Perfect. What a great introduction that normally sounds good at presentations that don't also include the likes of people from Cisco and biohackers and whatnot. So, no, I appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, for coming out. A quick little word. Thank you for coming to support BSides as well. I know we've got a lot of good presenters here, and it's good to see some faces and see some community here driven around cybersecurity and K-Man. A little bit about me. As it said, I was a red teamer for the last 8 years working at a public accounting firm in the US. I cut my teeth by doing penetration tests on a weekly basis, pretty much in every vertical and organization size you could think of. As I grew up and started as the pen tester, moved to the team lead and the manager. Obviously, by osmosis, I had to work with some of the other cyber compliance teams. So I picked up some of the tools of the trade when it came to helping them identify what the results from our pen tests were for assessing for SOC reports or ISO compliance and so on and so forth. And so kind of got a unique blend of being in the purple team as well. Professionally, I am a cyber practice lead for an MSP here on Island. Came down to try and help elevate cybersecurity levels for not only our organization, but also for the customers that we oversee. And then recently, the one that I'm really proud of, mostly just because there's a lot of other divers on the presentation panel, I wanted to show off and flex a little bit. I'm a recent dive master. Sometimes I can get some good, decent underwater pictures like this little turtle that I saw over at Eden Rock. So for those of you that aren't divers, sorry, that's just my little shameless plug that I had to put out there. So what's on the agenda for today? We'll get into a little bit, but CIMA's Statement of Guidance for Cybersecurity really just touches on how regulated entities need to work and deal with cyber risk as an organization. So we'll go over basically what it is, what are some of the hard requirements, what are some of the recommendations that they put in, key takeaways, and then probably talk a little bit about what the Statement of Guidance future may look like. A word for all of you and what's going to be in it for you. Unfortunately, I am the one thing keeping you from getting more coffee. You're not going to hurt my feelings if you need more coffee to stay awake during this presentation, just because it may be a little dry. And it's just because the Statement of Guidance, there were sometimes I had to use specific excerpts to be able to put it in and tie it to some bullet points. And for those of you that are visitors to the island, you may be able to find some little nuggets to be able to take away just to see where K-Man is as our cybersecurity maturity levels. And it may be able to help you kind of harken back if you're coming from a country or location that may be more regulated to be able to see where we are and probably where this is going to take us in the future. I tried to also break down some of the examples that they put specifically in the Statement of Guidance and what the requirements are, and just put them in common terms. As I was doing this presentation, and as I've spoken with different organizations and customers of mine on Island, I kept coming back to how do I just make this kind of the spark notes of the Statement of Guidance, right? For organizations that are worried about cyber risk and haven't really had to deal with it beforehand, what's kind of the quick bullet points you can give them? Again, it also heavily references the Statement of Guidance. As I was coming up with these spark notes, I realized that I'm probably going to have to PDF this up, send it to people. So if you want a copy of this, feel free to reach out to me afterwards. I try to put references for whatever I'm saying as kind of the proof in the pudding as it ties to the Statement of Guidance and the associated rule. And hopefully this is going to help you should CIMA come knocking on your door as you have to start going through those regulations and you get the regulators coming in to do their examinations as a regulated entity. So without further ado, we're going to talk about what the CIMA Statement of Guidance is. So CIMA really is breaking it down into 3 different entities or 3 different items, right? The first one I tried to highlight as well is essentially it's just intended to provide guidance to regulated entities on cybersecurity as a whole, right? And it sets what CIMA, the Cayman Islands Monetary Authority's minimum expectation is in relation to the management of cybersecurity risks. It applies to all regulated entities. I think the subsection is if you're working for a specific type of mutual fund on Island, but I was a business major that kind of flunked all the finance terms. So I'm not sure what the specific variations would be on what makes it regulated and what not based on the fund. but I know there is that little subsection in there. So the statement of guidance as a whole, in case you haven't read it or you just want the TLDR because it's too long or you didn't read it, is it essentially requires all regulated entities to care about cyber threats. It puts the impetus from whatever vendor or product you may be using on you as the regulated entity to make sure you're doing all of the right things to protect your fund and also all of the data that you have. Again, applies to all of the different regulated entities on island, and it ties in really nicely into the Cayman Data Protection Act. I think that realistically, what we're going to see is these two work synonymously, really helping organizations on island have to be able to take care of cybersecurity risk, and then also it's probably going to spill out and then start appealing or start applying to organizations that are not regulated entities. One thing that's worth noting is in CIMA Rule 5.4, Item A, they do call out that any regulated entity that has an outsourcing agreement or has to use a third-party vendor, they need to make sure that that vendor that they're choosing also adheres to all of these different guidelines. So if you're if you're a service provider, a third-party assessor, even though you're not going to get your door knocked on by CIMA, your customers do basically have the right to be able to say, hey, for vendor due diligence, we're going to go somewhere else just because it's our skin in the game. We don't really want to be held liable because you're not doing what you're supposed to. So what are really the hard requirements? And we could probably go over this and leave these bullet points here and then just call it a day. Everybody gets coffee earlier. But what I wanted to do was highlight again the really pertinent parts for the requirements. There's really just three specific ones. Item A in 5.1 basically says an organization or regulated entity must establish, implement, and maintain a documented cybersecurity framework. We'll get into what that is a little bit later. Here's where it's a little bit more reading, but basically that framework and all of the other risk management strategies need to be well documented. You have to make sure you have IT security policies and procedures. You need to make sure that you're showing managerial responsibilities and controls. And then also there needs to be a process that, again, is clearly documented and effective for responding to, containing, recovering from cyber attacks, breaches, and incidents. The last one, item C, essentially says that it needs to go through a regular review to constantly look at new and emerging threats with cybersecurity for the threat and IT landscape. Again, very standard things, but when it's written in the statement of guidance and the associated rule, can kind of get lost in translation a little bit. So I also gave another TLDR for anybody that didn't read it or didn't want to go through it. Three main things: come up with a cybersecurity framework, make sure you've got documented procedures and controls, and you're doing a cyclical review of emerging threats. The nice part is we're going to go through what the requirements breakdowns are. For a cybersecurity framework, for those of you that may not be familiar with it, or have implemented one before, this can seem kind of like a little bit of a mountain to climb, right? Really, all a cybersecurity framework is, if you take all the scary words and verbiage out of it, it's just guidance based on existing standards and managing to reduce cybersecurity risk. That's really all it is. It's just a collection of different things that dictate how an organization is going to move forward based on your entity and what type of risk you may have as an organization, how you're going to handle that, and what you're going to do to try and mitigate that moving forward for day-to-day operations. There's a lot of different frameworks that exist, and you want to make sure that you're choosing one that fits for your organization. CIMA calls out specific ones like NIST, the CIS, ISO, so on and so forth, but you want to make sure that when you're implementing the cybersecurity framework, doing a little bit of research, going online, figuring out what makes sense for you. If you're a regulated entity that's got 3 or 4 people, you don't need to go for ISO certification. That's like trying to bring a nuclear warhead to kill a fly, right? But if you're a larger organization that has multiple locations, came in as an office for it, it may make sense that the parent company or the other location has a more stringent framework that's implemented. The last thing you want to make sure that you're doing is that cybersecurity framework is going to be deemed successful based on what types of baselines it's defined to procedures of how, again, your organization is going to deal with that cyber risk. It's really meant to come up with, in that baseline, kind of a gap analysis of where your organization is and how far away it may be from that set of standards. You can start working with different type of cybersecurity maturity models if you want to. CMMC was another one that came out in the US. But essentially, it's just trying to say that, and this ties into what CIMA basically said earlier, here's what the minimum baseline is. In order to meet this threshold, you've got to make sure that your cybersecurity framework is going to do these different subsections, get it sorted for you. The last thing it's going to really do is it's going to outline a strategy for security teams. What is something that needs to happen now? What needs to happen at the end of the quarter? What needs to happen in the next year, 2, 3 years? It's really just trying to come up with a game plan to figure out what you need to do, again, to mitigate all of that cybersecurity risk. It's really simple, it's not scary, and it's pretty well close to being hand-holded when you implement a cybersecurity framework. What I tried to do was basically put into here again, kind of a little A+ about specific things you need to do with a statement of guidance. Again, for what CIMA is calling out for you to have a successful implementation of a cybersecurity framework is to be clearly well documented in item 6.2. Make sure it's built for your organization specific to those risk levels, right? What risk tolerance level you have. What is it you're willing to say, we're going to accept this risk, we've mitigated it, we're going to try and do risk transference based by a third party, so on and so forth. The last one is to make sure that you're doing cadence and improvement, cadence reviews and improvement cycles, 6.7 and 6.8. The nice part is any cybersecurity framework is also going to tie into the rest of the requirements and basically the rest of what statement of guidance is saying. When you're implementing a cybersecurity framework, it's going to go through all of those specific requirements in the statement of guidance. You can't have a cybersecurity framework implemented if you don't have IT policies and procedures. Those IT policies and procedures are going to help drive the organization. Wolfgang just talked about a great one for business continuity and disaster recovery. Dave spoke about some other ones as well about wider end user awareness training and how you need to be able to get people involved. So again, there's a lot of experts here on Island that kind of touched on it, experts on not only on Island, but also for presenting that have touched on it. And if you were paying attention, taking notes, would be able to be pretty easy to pick up on. So the last thing that the cybersecurity framework is going to touch base on and make sure you got implemented are any of the technical controls that are tied to cyber risk, essentially mapping out what is our risk, what does our exposure look like in different types of threats, what technical controls do we have in place, not only human controls, policies, and procedures, but making sure that you've got something handled in case an event came up. So with that, we're going to get into some of the technical and procedural controls. As Wolfgang also just spoke earlier too about getting everything in from the top down, IT policies and procedures should drive everything at an organization. I, as a cybersecurity practitioner, will say that if you're going to actually have to go forward with this as a regulated entity, it makes sense to, if you're going to implement policies and procedures, have them actually do something, have them be effective and meaningful. Don't just put something in there just because you've got a piece of paper that you're only going to pull out whenever an incident happens, or if you have something you need to react to as an organization. So don't check those boxes. The other thing that organizations should keep in mind too, especially for regulated ones here on Island, just because Cayman is unique in the fact that a regulated entity may just be a 3 or 4 person shop. It may also be a 3 or 4 person shop that's got a larger presence somewhere else in a different country. There's no real right way to be able to say what policies you need, right? I can't just give you a tier list, right, of top 4 or 5 policies that everything should be done. There's best practices and there's things that should be implemented for every organization, but you want to make sure that it fits to you. And the other thing to note too is nobody really cares, and no examiner is going to come through and say, your policy is only 4 pages long, like it needs to be 400 pages long. It needs to fit for your organization. If your policies and procedures need to have that much content that it needs to get through and kind of basically say how your organization should react and how it has data flows, then sure, have it be 400 pages long. But you want to make sure it fits, it's concise, and it's meant to be something that is actually read and digested for those key stakeholders in your organization. The technical procedural controls also identify, again, cyber risk for your organization. This is included in the cybersecurity framework. If you're implementing something like a NIST cybersecurity framework, for instance, it's going to go through and essentially map all of your different controls to cyber risk facing your organization. What are you doing for your backups? What do you have in place of EDR or mail type of threats? How are you measuring what identity protections you have cascading throughout your organization? What are you doing as an overarching control to make sure that you've got remote workforce and workers being able to make sure that they're locked down when they're trying to access things internally? Again, this is all mapped to a specific cybersecurity framework that you're going to have implemented. And the last one that helps with this too on this slide is having third-party attestation reports, mostly because what it's going to do is it's going to validate that the implementation that you have is successful, it's working, and it's also going to help reduce bias. You could say that if you wanted to, in an afternoon, you've implemented an entire cybersecurity framework and just given a check mark, talked to the CIO and said, yep, we're good, we're golden, does not matter. But again, that's just you saying that. Until it's actually been implemented and you have someone to check it, you're bringing in either an expert or somebody else who's gone through an implementation to be able to say, we can validate that this has been done effectively, and it's something that we think is going to be successful in helping protect the business. When you get to some of the other implemented technical controls, any good cybersecurity framework is going to call out, in a vendor agnostic standpoint, what type of controls need to be in place for, or what type of technical controls need to be in for a certain type of risk. Looking at your firewalls, your antivirus and your EDR tools, your event log management. How are you doing protections for your mail, network, and identity? These are all different things that are called out in any type of cybersecurity framework, whether you're choosing NIST or COBIT or CIS, to make sure that you can see from a 50,000-foot view, if this happens, then this control is going to be in place to give us some sort of protections. The last thing that the statement of guidance calls out, and I think this is going to be pretty evident from some of the other presentations that we have later today with biohacking and some of the other ones tomorrow, is that end user awareness training is key and is paramount to all of the cybersecurity frameworks. You could have a castle that's got walls that are 80,000 feet tall and 15 miles thick, and you've got a moat with sharks that have lasers on their heads waiting to keep everybody out. But if somebody lets them in through the back door, all of that is for naught. They've already got access to everything. So what you want to make sure that you're doing, and the statement of guidance calls this out specifically by calling out in the framework as well, is you want to do periodic tests to make sure that those end user awareness labels are at a specific level. You want to make sure when you're carrying out this test too, any type of security framework is going to call it out as well. This is not meant to discipline users. It's meant to help figure out where are we, how far do we need to go to get to the level of acceptance that we want to have to be able to meet the maturity model within our cybersecurity framework. So coming to that second requirement about the technical and procedural controls, I want to take a little bit of time to cover some of what those policies would be that I would expect to see and what every organization should have, right? Your overarching IT policy, which basically just outlines how an organization and employees interact with data and different resources. Your security policy, obviously defining what the protections and processes are in place for said resources. If you're a smaller organization, you can combine some of these, you can make them match and mold as you need to. But the more important thing is you need to make sure that you've got the specific content and they're actually speaking to these specific items. The IR policy, or incident response, basically defines teams and processes and procedures to deal with various types of incidents, not only from a technical and a security incident standpoint, but also any other type of natural disaster that may happen as well, which ties directly into the last one, which is your data breach policy. Again, how you're going to deal with what a data breach may look like in your organization. If there's specific regulatory requirements you may have, shout out to the ombudsman that's here, and we have to report everything that needs to be self-reported within a certain amount of time. You want to make sure that's listed in there, along with the person who's going to take the heat for when they have to have communications back and forth. Three more that we're going to touch on just as a briefly high level, and this ties into the end user awareness that we were speaking about before, is the acceptable use policy. How are users able to actually work with IT resources that belong to an organization? Are you restricting what they're supposed to be able to access on their phone or on their email? How are they supposed to use their web browser? Are you okay with people being on EventPro to figure out when the next FET's going to happen that they can go to and when they should be working? So this all ties into, again, these policies that should drive how an organization works. The second to last one is a privacy policy. This is especially evident in the days of GDPR, Cayman Data Protection Act, and everything else, basically to say how an organization receives and works with customer PII. PII being personally identifiable information, making sure that you've got a specific use case for it, you're treating it, and you're holding on to it for only as long as you need to. The last one is one that I like seeing because this will help you basically go from, we've got basic standard of controls and policies, and then the next iteration or the next evolution of the policies could be that much better, is a data classification policy. Basically dictates what data you have, what sensitivity it may be, whether it's going to be public, private, confidential, business confidential, and essentially what safeguards you have for that type of data. So what are we going to do to get an A+ when CIMA comes through? Again, in item 7.2 A through B, we're going to create cybersecurity for risk management. We're going to create some IT policies and procedures as listed in 6.2, 7.2, B, D, and E. And then we're going to utilize some proven technical controls, something that's tried and true. Again, vendor agnostic. It doesn't matter whether you're using a Cisco or a Palo Alto firewall, what type of EDR tool you're using. Just make sure you have something that is working and configured appropriately. So the last thing, and this is probably the easiest one to talk about as a requirement, are cyclical reviews. Anybody that's worked in security or pretty much IT in general will tell you that what happened 5 years ago and was the norm is not going to be the same that happens in the next 5 years. When I started in cybersecurity in the tail end of 2012, if you had told me that ransomware was going to be a thing that was going to have dedicated help desks to make sure that anybody who can't pay a ransom are going to get within 30 minutes of support to be able to help them, pay hackers to be able to unlock their data, I would not have believed you. So you need to make sure that you're staying on top of what those threats are, and you want to make sure that you're figuring out how your organization needs to respond. And the best way to do that is to have a dedicated role, either as a cybersecurity manager or a CISO, so on and so forth. But you need to have some person that's responsible for dictating how an organization needs to respond to new and emerging threats. The best way to do that is to be trying to have constant betterment. You want to perform a kind of a positive feedback loop, right? It doesn't make sense if it's always just security exists in a silo. You let us know. We'll see if we have budget to stop that threat. Maybe we'll get to it next week. Who knows? We'll figure it out. You want to find a way to be able to have whoever that person is that's responsible for cybersecurity, whether it be in a leadership position, a subsect of IT or IT teams in general, or a third party, is able to get the attention that they need to be able to say, hey, this is something, wake up, we got to figure out what we're going to deal with this new threat that comes in. The last one is you want to make sure, again, the best way to identify those new and emerging threats is a shameless plug for BSides. There are common interest groups that you could be involved in. There's plenty that are online that you can be a part of. Local things like BSides are good for this. There's some people speaking from MITRE and Attack later that are going to talk about how you can map specific threats from a certain type of state actor to a specific organization in a region or a type of industry, and what type of things to look for. What are those attack patterns? How do you know what that data looks like to be able to better protect yourself? The other thing that you can always do too, which is not as much fun as going to events like this, is to read vendor alerts for vulnerabilities that come out. Right? If you get a blast email from Fortinet saying that there's a new exploit that's available and there's new CVEs that have been discovered, you need to patch. Make sure you read them, understand what's happening, or give that to the person that's the dedicated leadership role for cybersecurity to read, and help them update that cybersecurity framework of how you react to those threats. I think one of the most recent ones was Log4j, kind of caught everybody with their pants down, because everybody's like, I don't use Java in my organization. It's like, what about Apache? And like, yeah, you got me right there. Okay, we need to go back and revisit that. So having that person that's dedicated in that leadership role, or someone that's responsible for cybersecurity and constant betterment, is going to help your organization. So what do we do to get an A+ when CIMA comes through? Again, regular reviews of cybersecurity framework and associated policies and procedures. Making sure that those policies and procedures are going through a standard cadence of being reviewed. Most organizations do it annually. That's fine. If you have any big overarching changes to the organization or the way that data interacts with your organization, I would say update it right afterwards. Dedicated roles, creating a feedback loop. Feedback loop is specifically called out in the statement of guidance. I would say that they're most likely going to eventually look for some sort of either meeting minutes or not, to be able to say, hey, we noticed an alert, we noticed some type of event that either that needed to get escalated and dealt with, or was a near miss. How are we going to deal with things like that in the future? I'm sure they're going to want to be able to see things like that. And then lastly is we need to see ownership by senior leadership. So what I will do as I take a sip of water is we'll go through what some of the recommendations are. CIMA was so gracious to give us 3 specific requirements and then kind of just sprinkle in some recommendations throughout the rest of the statement of guidance. They're kind of haphazardly placed through the statement of guidance. For me, again, I'm a cybersecurity practitioner, so I'm not going to be the guy that just says, yep, check boxes, you're good, send it over the fence, or let the next security guy deal with it. So these are things that you should just do, right? We would also, and I say we because I'm saying it on this behalf of all the cybersecurity professionals that have read the statement of guidance, these are most likely going to become hard requirements in version 2 when it comes out. Again, I can't really reiterate this. You should really just do these because they kind of will be tied into your cybersecurity framework anyway. And as you start getting third-party attestation reports, you want to be able to say, yep, we've got the gold star, check plus, A++, we're good to go. So RJ, what are those recommendations? Well, I've got them up here, and I also tie them directly to the CIMA statement of guidance. Again, the third-party attestation reports are something that they highly recommend. They have a whole dedicated section to that. And again, I think that's going to be something that's going to become very much a requirement moving forward, saying, okay, great, you've implemented a cybersecurity framework. That's great for version 1. let's drill into it and see what somebody else who has a cybersecurity framework implemented says about your work. Are they going to be able to verify it and say, this is great, there may be some things they need to work on, but this is a good solid foundation for their organization. They also recommend specific penetration testing and vulnerability assessments. You can tie this into a third-party attestation report. This is really just working with the cybersecurity company, whether it be one on islands, third party, off island, whatever, to essentially act as an adversary and figure out where those threats exist in your organization. Can they be exploited? What data can you get to? CIMA calls it out as a recommendation and then also kind of a soft requirement when it comes to your end user awareness training. But they did harp on this in 2 different sections. So I think this is something that if you're going to make an IT policy, you want to make sure that you've got your acceptable use and your end user awareness policy, and you're doing constant reviews, making sure that they just understand at whatever cadence you want, whether it be annually, you do it every 18 months, however you wish, that they understand what threats they face on a day-to-day basis, how they should react to it, and then when should they just say, I'm going to pull the rip cord and get someone else to look at this because this is above my pay grade. I don't know what this is, but I don't want to cause any detriment to the company. The last one, and this is where it kind of ties into that section that I mentioned beforehand at the beginning of the presentation for third-party and managed service providers, is they really, really harp on vendor due diligence. Vendor due diligence is something that, if you're not familiar with it, it's essentially just doing a suss out test of anybody you're working with to say, yep, we choose this person as our cloud provider, or we choose this person as somebody that's going to handle our IT outsourcing agreement. And we've verified that the standards that they hold themselves to are the same ones that we hold ourselves to. And then that way you can make sure that you've got a little bit of a CYA, you're making sure that you're doing business with someone else that is verified as actually doing the things they say they're doing. Has anybody heard, or does anybody know how the Target breach happened a couple of years ago? I think probably like 6 years now, right? Supply chain, right? And again, you could probably make the argument that there were other things that were happening, right? As far as maybe they shouldn't have been on the same network as some of their vendors, so on and so forth. But again, it was their vendor due diligence. The way Target got breached was one of their HVAC vendors got hacked. It had nothing to do with Target. But because they were on the same network, they were able to get one of their vendors, get in once they had a foothold, then they moved over to Target. So again, this kind of goes into, it's kind of an easy example, and you could make the argument that that's vendor due diligence, right? But you would also certainly find that by the third-party attestation reports, doing pen testing, doing vulnerability assessments. It's all very cyclical. But you want to make sure that anybody you're working with, especially in IT, and especially if you're an organization that doesn't have a dedicated internal team, you've got an outsourcing agreement, you've checked them out, they've gone through the sus test, because at the end of the day, it's not the third party that's going to be liable, it's you. So what are some key takeaways that we have for this? Well, the first one is, again, finding a cybersecurity framework that's specific for your organization. The implementation is going to tackle the statement of guidance requirements anyway. It's something that there's no way you can implement a statement of guide or a cybersecurity framework without actually getting through all the different things that would be required. So finding one and implementing it, working with a third party that's gone through this process and these procedures beforehand, is absolutely going to be able to take you across the finish line. The second one would be creating IT policies that are actually useful, right? We talked about a little bit before, don't just write it home and just have one that is a policy that you've created and you touched on it once, maybe, again, a couple months ago, you've updated some things since then, you've changed the way people work remotely, and then you just don't look at it. That's just not useful for anybody. And again, as an organization, you need to be better than that. For people that are worried about what policies they should use or how do they go about them, there's a lot of free policies that are templates that are available online. But again, please keep in mind that they are just that. They're templates. They're meant for you to be able to tweak them and move them and massage it to what works for your organization, and not specifically just say, yeah, whatever Purple Team Sec says is exactly what I'm going to put in my organization. Those are the same data classification policies we're going to have, and match it up. It may work, but again, you need to have some way to verify that and look over that information. When you're creating these policies, it's really important to involve all of the key stakeholders. What you don't want to do is create a policy and then write it from a specific IT level, right, that matches up with the IT department, and then just give it to senior leadership, and they look at it, kick it back, and say, what is this? This doesn't work for our business model. right? You didn't work with different teams. You didn't figure out how these data flows are going to affect someone else on a different department, or accounting is going to be able to kick this back because they've got an application that can't meet these recovery time applications. So you want to make sure that you're including all of the key people. The third takeaway is going to be fostering a culture of cybersecurity awareness. Again, this is probably the fourth or fifth time I've talked about awareness, specifically end user awareness. But having a culture of positivity and understanding what those threats are in the workplace and what they see on a day-to-day basis is going to make your organization that much better. I've heard people refer to every user and every day that they're logging in, you want to train them to be a cyber ninja, right? You want to train them to be diligent. What are they expecting when they log in and they check their Outlook for the day? What type of threats are they expecting if they get some data being sent to them, and how do they interact with it? You can call them that if you want, but really you just need to make sure that everyone understands what the threats are and they really know exactly how to act with that. The last takeaway that I would say is also, again, and I cannot harp on it enough, is doing periodic third-party reviews. This is just the right way of doing it, right? You could sit there and say that I'm a contractor. I watched a YouTube video one time of like somebody building a house, right? It was just like a 10-minute video, but I get it. Dig some holes, put some posts in there, throw some floor joists in together. Done, solid, ready to go. All of a sudden, you get a tropical storm that comes through in Cayman. That house is not going to make it. There's different regulations and requirements for having third-party people come through, because they can help validate that what you're doing is being done effectively. And that's what the real benefit is in having a third-party assessment. So as I close, I'll stop here and ask a little bit if there's questions. If there's not, that's fine. I will be able to PDF this up, send it over to you. Again, I tried to write this as kind of just a spark note to be able to say, this is just meant to be a quick reference guide. But I guess I will hand it over to anyone in the audience if there's any questions specifically about cybersecurity or specific to the the statement of guidance. That's honest. Yes. Yep. I would say that the correct answer for reporting back needs to be dictated by what you have in your policies and procedures. As far as being able to effectively give back to management what it is that we're good, where we're successful and where we're not successful, right? So if you need to be able to give some hard evidence back to key management, you want to be able to say from a very high level, here's something that happens, right? So if we take an example for, let's say someone clicked on a phishing email, a simple one, right? And then their account was compromised. If I was senior leadership, I would like to be able to say, here's what time that incident happened. Here's how long it took us to identify it, took us to kind of wrap our hands around the rule, and then be able to ultimately remediate that finding. That would be the first thing I would want. And then the next follow-up will most likely be, what was the root failure, right? What is it that we think we can implement? Why was it something that was able to get back? And then ultimately go back into your lessons learned and then be able to say, how do we prove that to not happen in the future? How do we then have that cyclical and that constant feedback loop to be able to say, hey, yep, we had a mistake. Either something wasn't implemented or configured appropriately. How do we keep this from happening in the future? So that's just an easy example, but it may be that you want more detail based on what your policies and procedures are, or it may be based on the severity of the data that's going through based, and again, on your data classification policy. So kind of a loaded, unloaded answer. Like, is it also a non-committal answer, but there's a lot of different ways you could skin that cat. Perfect. Anyone else? All right. Well, that's everything that I've got. Appreciate y'all. Have a good one.